Welcome. I'm Dr. David Adams. In this session, we'll be reading Jeremiah chapter 15, verses 10 to 15. Besides serving as a lectionary reading, this text is interesting because it presents us with several different kinds of difficulties at the same time. Most of all, this text is valuable to us because it illustrates a fallacy that many beginning interpreters work with. Beginning interpreters often think that understanding a text is a matter of understanding the words. So they place an overemphasis on knowing the dictionary meaning of a word and on being able to parse the verb forms. And they think that if they can do these things, if they know the vocabulary and if they can parse the verbs, they've read and understood the text. But reading a text involves a great deal more than knowing the meaning and the form of the individual word, as we'll see. So let's begin by reading our text. Oili imi, woe is me, O my mother. The first word, oi, is an interjection. It introduces a thought that expresses dismay at some impending disaster or lamentation over one's situation. Here we immediately run into the problem of the connection between this verse and what precedes it. Who is the my mother to whom the speaker refers? Is it Jeremiah's biological mother? Or is it Jerusalem, who is the metaphorical mother, who is ashamed and disgraced because of the judgment that has come upon her and her people in verse 9? Ki yelitini ishriv wa ishmadon lakol haaretz. Because you gave birth to me, a man of conflict and a man of strife to the whole land. The verb form yelitini can be challenging to parse. It's a call perfect second feminine singular from the root yalav, yod, lamed, daleth, with a first person suffix as the object. When used of women, this verb refers to giving birth. When used of men, it refers to begetting an offspring. The form without the suffix would have been yalat. Adding the suffix adds a syllable, and that moves the accent toward the end of the word. As a result, the vowel under the yod reduces to a vocal schwa. The older form of the second feminine singular affirmative ti returns under the influence of the accent. And finally, the pathak under the lamed becomes a heric. This is a phonological shift that happens often in biblical Hebrew, mostly in closed, unaccented syllables. But it's not something that most students learn about in first year Hebrew. So don't feel too bad if you struggle to understand that one. There are a couple of issues that impact how you understand what's being said in this part of the verse. The first thing is how we understand the construct chains ishriv and ishmadon. You know, of course, that the construct chain in Hebrew is used to indicate a close relationship between two forms, most often either an adjectival or a genitival relationship. But a genitival relationship can be either a subjective genitive or an objective genitive, to use the terms from classical grammar. For example, In the suffering servant song of Isaiah 53, verse 3, we have a reference to the servant as an ish makavoth, a man of pain. In the context, this clearly means a man who has endured or suffered pain. That's an objective genitive. By contrast, in Exodus 15, verse 3, Yahweh is described as an ish milchama, a man of war. In the context of the song by the sea, this can only mean that Israel's God is a one who wages war on behalf of his people. That would be a subjective genitive. So here's how this affects the meaning of this verse. If we take it as an objective genitive, then we understand it to mean that the speaker has endured conflict and strife. So the NIV renders this as a man with whom the whole land strives and contends. By contrast, the Christian Study Bible, or CSB, takes this as a subjective genitive, referring to a man who causes conflict and strife. So the CSB renders it a man who incites dispute and conflict in all the land. Before we can decide whether to read these phrases as objective or subjective genitives, we need to read the rest of the verse. So let's go there now. Lo nasithi wa lo nashuvi kula makal laoni. The first part of this is easy enough. I have not borrowed, and they have not borrowed from me. The verb nasha, nun, shin, aleph, means either to lend or to borrow. It can even mean to deceive. As in Isaiah 24:2, when this verb is used of borrowing, the preposition based following it indicates the source of the loan, the creditor, as we might say. And we have that same usage here. As an interpretive matter, I think we might take the idea of lending and borrowing here as representing the things that God had forbidden. It's a form of a figure of speech that we call metonymy. Remember in Exodus 22, verse 25, and Leviticus 25, verses 36 and 37, God had forbidden the Israelites from loaning money at interest. And the speaker here is using that prohibition to stand for all sorts of public morality. His point is that he hasn't done anything that ought to make people mad at him. And this leads us to the last verse of the phrase. But before we can translate that, we have to deal with textual apparatus notes 10D and 10E. These need to be considered together. The problem here is that the last word in the sentence doesn't make any sense. And that's what textual note 10E is about. The form as we have it in the text appears to be pointed as a plea participle with a first-person object suffix from the root kalal, kof lamed lamed, meaning to curse. But the problem is the wow in the form. If this is a participle, then there's no way to explain this wow except as perhaps a random error by a copyist. We might read this as a PL perfect, third plural, with the same first-person suffix. But then we have a different problem, a problem with the meme on the front of the form, and this leads us to textual note 10D. As it's pointed, the form kulo is the word whole, all or the whole, with the hey being an alternate form of the third masculine singular, all of it, apparently referring back to the land. The textual note points us to the easy solution here. When Jeremiah, or his scribe Baruch, wrote the text, it would have looked like this. This is the old Hebrew script, as it looked in Jeremiah's time in the early 6th century. Note that there are not only any vowels, there are no final forms of letters and no spaces in the text. So what happened is this. When the scribes of the Second Temple period later copied the text, they added spaces to make it easier to read, and they also used the Aramaic square script that we're familiar with today. So when they added spaces, they then divided the text like this. But they should have divided it like this. So the textual note and the editors of BHS are quite correct. We should read this not as all of it, but as all of them, followed by a PL perfect, third plural, with the first person suffix. All of them have cursed me. The final clause of this verse solves the problem of the question of whether this was a subjective or objective genitive that we were referring to just a moment ago. When the speaker says about the people cursing him despite his not having done anything wrong, that makes it clear that we should take those construct chains as objective genitives. The speaker is the object or the recipient of the conflict and the strife, not the cause of it. So putting all this together and smoothing it out and adding some little bits to make good modern English, we should read this verse 10 as, "Woe is me, my mother, because in me you have a man who suffers the conflict and strife of the whole land, despite the fact that I neither borrow from them or loan money to them at interest. They all curse me." Well, that was easy enough. Now let's go on to a really hard verse. Amar Yahweh, imlo tzeritika latov, imlo hifgativaka, ba'eth ra'ah, uba'eth sarah, eth ha'oyev. Verses 11 and 12 are the sort of text that drives interpreters to frustration, if not despair. As William Holliday has noted in his commentary, these two verses bristle with interrelated problems, few of which can be solved with finality. Indeed, there is disagreement among commentators on almost every point here. But as troublesome as these two verses are, I'm not convinced that the problem is quite as intractable as Holliday and others suggest. First, verse 11. To illustrate the problems here, let's compare four English translations. First, the ESV. The Lord said, "Have I not set you free for their good? Have I not pleaded with you before the enemy in time of trouble and in time of distress?" Now, the NIV. The Lord said, "Surely I will deliver you for a good purpose. Surely I will make your enemies plead with you in times of disaster and times of distress." Now, the NET. The Lord said, "Jerusalem, I will surely send you away for your own good. I will surely bring the enemy upon you in a time of trouble and distress." And finally, the New Jerusalem Bible. "Have I not genuinely done my best to serve you, Yahweh? Have I not interceded with you in time of disaster and distress?" Wow, what a difference in those four translations. We're not going to go through each of them word by word and explain them, but here are a couple of things that we should note. First, three of these begin with the phrase, "the Lord said." But the New Jerusalem Bible omits this phrase entirely, so that the speaker in what follows is not Yahweh at all, but Yahweh is the one being spoken to. Second, there's a clear difference in how they understand the word translated pleaded by the ESV. The NIV translates this word as deliver, and the NET translates it as send away. The New Jerusalem Bible translates it as to serve. So that's clearly a problem that needs to be sorted out. Third, the ESV takes the second sentence as a question. "Have I not pleaded with you before the enemy?" The NIV takes it as a statement. "Surely I will make your enemies plead with you." So they're reading the verb form differently there. The NET, again, has a statement, but a very different statement. "Surely I will bring the enemy upon you." Here there's no notion of pleading at all. And finally, the New Jerusalem Bible has the speaker asking a question of God. "Have I not interceded with you?" Finally, the NET has God speaking to Jerusalem. And the word Jerusalem does not appear in any of the other translations of the Hebrew text. It doesn't occur in the Masoretic text or in the Septuagint. So where did they get that? Now, let's turn to the text itself and see if we can sort through some of these issues. The text begins, "Amar Yahweh." This seems straightforward enough. Yahweh said, or the Lord said, if you prefer. But note the textual apparatus, note 11a. This tells us that the Septuagint has the word genoito, which the editors suggest can be explained by reading the Hebrew text as amen. That is, with the last letter being a nun instead of a resh. I think the editors of BHS have missed the point with this suggestion. Here, the editors have taken the Septuagint as evidence of an alternate textual tradition, but I think they would have been better served to have understood it as evidence of an interpretive tradition rather than a textual tradition. Here's why I think that. In the Hebrew text, the phrase imlo is used twice. In biblical Hebrew, imlo is used within oath formulas. You may recall that Hebrew oath formulas can be notoriously difficult, mostly because the apodosis is often omitted. But that makes the oath hard to see. Well, in Greek, genoito is sometimes used in oath formulas as well. So I think that what the Septuagint's reading of genoito is telling us is not that they had a different Hebrew text with a different word, amen, as the editors suggest, but that the translators of the Septuagint understood this text as an oath. So reading it as an oath here is how I'm going to take it. The subject is the same speaker as in verse 10, and the addressee is Yahweh, as the New Jerusalem Bible reads it. So I'm going to read this as an oath sworn to God by the speaker of verse 10. He said, O Lord, may something bad happen to me. That's the apodosis that was omitted that I'm adding back in for logic's sake. So he said, O Lord, may something bad happen to me if I have not sherithika you well. I'm translating latov as well because I'm taking the lamed as an adverbial lamed, meaning something like in a good way. Now, let's deal with the problem of the form sherithika. First, we have to see that this is a kathiv kare reading. That is, it's a form that the Masoretes believe has been wrongly copied somewhere along the way, and they have tried to indicate to us how we should understand it. They do that by putting the vowels of what they believe to be the correct word with the consonants of the word that was actually written in the text that they had in front of them, the word that they think is a mistake. And then they place what they think are the correct consonants in the margins of the manuscript. So if you're working with a printed copy of BHS, you want to combine the vowels in the text with the consonants printed in the margin. If you're reading the text in Logos Bible software, this is presented in an interlinear form. And all you have to do is read the bottom form of the list of three. Either way, in this case, we should read the form as sherithika, a simple mistake of copying a wow for a yod. This is a very easy mistake to make when copying an ancient manuscript, and there are many examples of this in ancient manuscripts. Now, if we were to parse this form, it would be a PL perfect, first common singular, with a second person object suffix here from the root shara, shin resh he. The problem is, what does this word mean? The root only occurs 3 times in the Tanakh at the most. It occurs in the PL here, in the call in Job 37:3, and in the nifal in Habakkuk 2:4. The Dictionary of Classical Hebrew lists 4 possible different verbs spelled this way that mean either to let loose or release, to flash as in a light flashing, to direct, or to multiply. The ESV, NIV, and NET have all opted for a base meaning of let loose or release, but they've colored the sense of the PL differently, one translating it set free, another translating it deliver, the third send away. The problem with each of these is that it's very difficult to make sense of what's being said, regardless of who you think is speaking. But the New Jerusalem Bible translates this verb as serve. How did they get that? The answer is that they have come to the conclusion that metathesis between the tau and the yod have occurred. So that instead of reading the form as sharithika, they read it as sherathika. While this exact form doesn't occur elsewhere, the verb sharath, shinresh tau, is quite common, occurring almost 100 times, always in the peel, as it is here. And in this case, I think that they have it right. So we might translate this part of the oath as, he said, "O Lord, may something bad happen to me if I have not served you well." We'll come back to how this fits into the context after we look at the next clause, which continues the oath. Imlo hifkativaka ve'esra'a uve'esara eth hayoyev. If I have not engaged you in prayer in the time of distress and in time of strife with the enemy. The only real issue here is how to understand the Hifil perfect first singular of paga, pei gimel ayin. In the call, this verb means to meet or to encounter, but it doesn't specify the kind of encounter that takes place. The Dictionary of Classical Hebrew lists as a second meaning for both the call and the hifil the sense of meeting with a request or to entreat. And that, I think, is the sense here. The ESV, the NIV, and the New Jerusalem Bible all employ this sense of the verb as well. And when we're talking about entreating God or encountering God with an entreaty, we usually call that praying. So I rendered this as engaged you in prayer, but you could simplify it to render it simply, if I have not prayed to you. So before we put all this together, let's go ahead and deal with verse 12, because it's a continuation of this same response to the judgment that God has pronounced through the prophet. Hayaroa, Barzel, Barzel Mitzafon, Nachosheth. In describing this verse, the United Bible Society's Handbook for Translators of Jeremiah says, although this verse is brief, it is difficult to interpret, and a number of scholars give it up as hopeless. Here the problem is not with the words, it's with making sense out of the words in the context. The translation is straightforward enough. Can iron break iron of the north and bronze? The only minor difficulty is with the first word. As written, it's a call imperfect, third masculine singular with a hey interrogative attached to the front. The root is ra'ah, resh ayin ayin, and there are two roots spelled this way in Biblical Hebrew. The more common one, used nearly 100 times, means to be bad or to do bad things. The less common one, used about 10 times, means to break. Most English translations take this as the second of those two roots, and I agree with them in that. The speaker is simply asking whether iron by itself can break iron that's been reinforced with bronze. The phrase "from the north" is inserted because this is a metaphor for Judah's enemies from the north, especially Babylon. So let's put verses 11 and 12 together and see what they're saying. In these verses, the people of Jerusalem are personified as a first-person speaker who are trying to avert God's wrath by defending themselves and pleading their own cause. So in verse 11, they swear that they've served God well and they've called upon him in times of trouble. This last point is important for two reasons. First, one of the most common problems with Judah in the divided kingdom period is the way that they always tried to solve all their own political and military problems by themselves, by forming alliances with Egypt and Assyria and Babylon, and depending on the military power rather than trusting in God to protect them and depending on him alone. You may remember that through Isaiah, God says to them, "Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, who trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel or consult the Lord." Here in verse 11, the Judahites are swearing that that's the very thing they did not do. They swear that they have served God well, and they have called upon him in time of distress from their enemies. And then verse 12 connects to this idea by asking whether iron alone can break iron from the north reinforced with bronze. In asking that, they're in effect saying, we called upon you when under distress from our enemies from the north because we realized that our own strength, that is iron, is not enough to overcome their greater strength, iron reinforced with bronze. So, I'm going to differ from the vast majority of interpreters in that I do not think verses 10, 11, and 12 are a personal lament of Jeremiah at all, but an attempt at self-justification on the part of the people of Jerusalem. There's pretty widespread agreement that verses 13 and 14 should be read together as a unit, and that Yahweh is speaking. There is, however, disagreement over exactly who it is that Yahweh is speaking to. Many presume that if Jeremiah is speaking in the previous verses, God's response should be directed at him. But attempting to read the verse that way creates a number of interpretive problems. There are phrases here that just kind of don't make sense if you're talking about the prophet. And so Walter Brueggemann, among other commentators, observes the following. He writes, "This oracle is not an oracle of comfort for Jeremiah, who has complained of his trouble. Rather, it is yet another decree of judgment against Judah." Those are issues that we'll have to consider. But first, let's look at the text. Kilka wa'otrofecha lavazatem lo b'mechir ubakol hatorofecha ubakol gavulecha. Again, there are a number of textual notes here. Most of these textual notes arise from the fact that we have a very similar passage in Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 3 and 4. And some commentators want to try to reconcile these two. As textual note 13b observes, the equivalent of lo is also missing in both the Septuagint and the Syriac of 1513. More to the point, the phrase as it stands, without price, really doesn't make all that much sense in verse 13, and the base is a little hard to interpret as well. So I'm inclined to agree with the editor's suggestion that we should delete the lo here and read the text without lo. That would give us a reading something like this. Your wealth and your treasure I will give for plunder as the price for all your sins throughout all your territory. V'ha'averti es ovecha b'kol lo yadata ki esh kadacha ba'af alekim tu kav. There are two textual variant proposals that I think are worth talking about here. First, note 14a suggests that we read the first word as coming from the root avad, ayin beth dalet, meaning to serve, instead of avar, ayin beth resh, meaning to cross over. I'm going to accept this suggestion as the original reading for three reasons. First, there's significant support for it in Hebrew manuscripts themselves and in the Targums. Indeed, it also fits the Septuagint's reading of enslave, although the textual note doesn't mention the Septuagint's reading. And third, it just makes more sense in the context. And by the way, a number of modern translations, including the ESV, also accept this variant. The second textual note that's worthy of serious consideration is note 14c. It suggests that we adopt the reading found in some other Hebrew manuscripts of ad olam, forever, instead of alekim, against you. The ESV adopts this reading, but I'm not going to. The Septuagint agrees with Codex Leningrad in this case, as do most other Hebrew manuscripts. And the text is perfectly understandable and it makes perfectly good sense as it is. All we have to do is put a period before the last clause in English. And doing that gives us the following rendition of the verse. I will make you serve your enemies in a land you do not know. For a fire is kindled because of my anger. It burns against you. Ata yadata Yahweh. The first phrase, Ata yadata, you yourself have known. The next clause is similarly straightforward. Zakarti upakavdeni. Remember me and visit me. For God to know his people is for him to accept them and for them to be in a right relationship with him. For God to remember his people is for him to act on that relationship. So in saying this, the speaker is reminding God that he has called them to be his people and praying that God will act on their behalf. And this leads us to the verb pakad, pay, ko, daleth. Most of the time, this verb refers to paying attention to something. But when talking about God, it's often used in the negative sense of God's judging or condemning something. However, other times it refers to God paying attention in a positive sense. In those cases, and this is one of them, it's another salvation term. Here, it goes with and reinforces the meaning of remember. So we might translate these two verbs together as something like remember me and deliver me. Now, the specific kind of deliverance that the speaker is asking for is spelled out in the rest of the verse. V'hem nachimli merodofani. Avenge me on those who pursue me, or a better translation here would be, on those who persecute me. The speaker asks God to avenge him. Now, language like this is sometimes difficult for us Christians because we're a little uncomfortable with praying for God to take vengeance on someone. The prophet claims that he has not done anything to earn the persecution that he's receiving. And rather than attempt to take revenge into his own hands, he's praying that God would stand up for him and put things right. So really, what the speaker is praying for here is what we would call justice, setting right something that's wrong. The next bit is problematic for a different reason, and it may be helpful to read this together. Al lo erek afka tikacheni da she'esi alecha cherfa. The phrase al la'erek seems odd. Al is a particle of negation, most often used as an adverb to negate a second person volitive verb. The only candidate for that here is the verb tikacheni. This would give us a sense of do not take me away, which is fine. That, in effect, is what the ESV does with it. However, it would be unusual to have other words stuck between the al and the verb that it negates. So that's a bit of a problem. But I think there's a way to read this that does make sense of the text as it stands while respecting the normal grammatical usage of these terms. And that would be to take the al as doing what we call double duty. Now, this is a feature of Hebrew, especially common in Hebrew poetry, in which a term is written one time, but is understood to be used where it's written, and then again with a different word later in the verse without being written over again. And taking it that way, I would read it as if this verse said, Al tihyeh le'erek afeka al tikacheni. Now, I treated this as if the second person imperfect form of haya, to be, is written in the text. However, forms of haya, you may remember, are often omitted in Hebrew. And then reading it as if it were there lets al perform its usual function of negating the verb. This brings us finally to our last clause. Da she'esi alecha cherfa. No, this is a call imperative masculine singular from yada, yod daleth ayin, to know. My bearing, this is a call infinitive construct of nasa, nun, sin, aleph, to lift or bear or carry. On account of you, or better, for your sake, cherfa. And cherfa is a noun for shame or disgrace or reproach. So, putting the whole of verse 15 together, I would read something like this. Remember me and deliver me. Avenge me on those who persecute me. Do not let your anger be for long. Do not take me away. Rather know that I have borne disgrace for your sake. So that's the text. Now we have to consider the bigger problems. There are two of these. First, who is speaking? And second, does verse 15 belong with what comes before or with what comes after? In the context, verse 15 appears to be a response to the judgment of God pronounced in verses 13 and 14. If that's correct, then the speaker is the same as the speaker previously in verses 10 to 12. And as I said before, most interpreters take this to be Jeremiah. Now, that requires a major break between verse 9 and verse 10. And it also creates quite a few problems explaining what the text is saying if it's talking about Jeremiah. And that's what leads commentators to view this as a very problematic text. As I've already said, I don't understand the text that way. I see this whole discourse as a continuation of the judgment upon the people of Jerusalem that was being proclaimed in the chapter leading up to this passage. And I understand the speaker in verses 10 to 12, and then again here in verse 15, to be the people of Jerusalem figuratively personified in the first person and attempting to justify themselves before God by claiming that they've done everything that God expects of them. The second problem, the question of whether verse 15 goes with 10 to 14 or with what follows in verses 16 and later, also becomes less of a problem if we understand what follows in verses 16 and following as a further attempt on the part of the people of Jerusalem to justify themselves before God. Verse 15 to 18 give us the claim of the people to have done all that is expected of them. And then verses 19 to 21 give us God's response. If they would genuinely repent and stop uttering these worthless claims, then God would restore them and be with them and redeem them. The main thing that you should take away from looking at this text is the realization that understanding a text requires more than just knowing the individual words of the text. Knowing the words and being able to parse the verbs does not mean that you understand the text. Knowing the meaning of the text requires that you understand how the words are working together in the particular context in which they stand. It means considering the form of the literature that you're dealing with, the structure of the text, and how it works thematically and pragmatically. And while we haven't dealt in detail with each of those features in this session, we've tried to show how those concerns come together to shape a coherent reading of the text. And I hope that you found the exercise helpful beyond simply understanding this one passage from the book of Jeremiah a little better. Well, I'm Dr. David Adams, and thank you for joining me as we've read Jeremiah chapter 15, verses 10 to 15 together. And I hope you'll join me again as we read and study God's Word together.